Um, First, I want to offer a very heartfelt thank you to Joe Elder. I came to him with the idea and said it's about time we started a teach-in. Joe and I were in the first teach-ins in Wisconsin way back when, and he and I used to do these truth-themed kind of appearances on the radio trying to talk about Vietnam. And I guess you never get out of the habit. So Joe took on the whole business of getting sponsorship in this room and so on, and set things up so that we could have what in a way is a precursor to the teach-in we'll probably have to have next fall. I guess I could say half of my talk has been thrown out by these two excellent scholars here, but I need to say a few things, even though they might sound repetitious. My specialty has been the study of guerrilla warfare tactics and counter-guerrilla warfare tactics in a variety of countries. And that's how I approached this. I admit I knew nothing about Afghanistan until I started some serious reading in 2008, and I spent the summer really trying to bone up. I had to choose between Iran and Afghanistan. I decided it was more likely to be war in Afghanistan than Iran. I will just mention that from the viewpoint of counterinsurgency, here are the factors that any counterinsurgency campaign has to take into account. The size of the country, its horrendous mountainous areas, the fact that it's a border region between two core civilizations, the climate with a hot, dry fighting season, and the regrouping season of very bitter cold winter and when the counterinsurgents have trouble. 7 major hostile ethnic groups, 6 major languages, and phony boundaries in terms of the old business of slipping across the border, particularly the Pashtun in the south. Religion that's very complex and alien to the United States in terms of both folk Islam, puritanical fundamentalism, a late import, the Shiites, a variant like Catholics and Protestants, and a horrendous social cultural anthropology that would drive any anthropology student batty trying to prepare for a final in it, in terms of the mores of the tribes. And when I say tribes, I'm thinking that you should all remember the Apache and the Sioux and the Navajo and so forth. These are tribes. They have ancestors, and they wage tribal warfare with each other in the past. And they also have different concepts of honor and revenge, but they're all united about anti-foreignism. So that is the base for the insurgency. We're now talking about not the Taliban, but the neo-Taliban, since there's been a very subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, shifts between the old Taliban, who were essentially the students. The word has to do more with the students. They came out of the religious schools, especially the ones that were built in Pakistan by our dear ally, Saudi Arabia, to get their fundamentalists to turn abroad. So they cranked out every year several thousand Afghan students who wanted to wage holy war. They actually have been fighting, among other things, the elders, the traditional elders, had a much softer kind of Islam in terms of recruiting. So I looked at this, one of the most recent studies, the one that's mentioned with these maps, is actually quite excellent. He covered 5 areas: ideology, recruitment, organization, strategy, and military tactics. And what was interesting to me from the viewpoint of counterinsurgency was that the Taliban is actually weak. They should be able to be beaten because they don't do something that the best of the revolutionary movements did. The Vietnamese with land reform, for example, the Chinese with land reform, anti-Japanese resistance, and women's rights. They don't have a really positive program. They don't try to construct a shadow government where they try to provide services to the people the way any number of other guerrilla movements did. Instead, they focus on a very simple ideology of Islam, puritanical Islam. They recruit. The only positive thing is that the tribal structure has been beaten down through the last 25 years, and so the youth, there's a youth bulge age-wise in Afghanistan. Don't have much of an economic future, and joining the Taliban is one of the ways. They actually have a primitive organization. The U.S. used to have to torture and kill thousands of people, thousands of NLF cadre in Vietnam to get the information, and they still ended up with knowing that the whole Saigon government was totally infiltrated by the Vietnamese communists. It isn't anything like that. There were a half dozen small councils of 15 to 20 men who make crude or permanent decisions. There are 5 military zones and very small provincial and locality leaderships. We're talking handfuls of people based largely on personal power and a lot of local sort of history there, who aren't very well trained. In fact, one of their great vulnerabilities, according to the U.S. counterinsurgency, is they do not have many trained people. They have lots of enthusiastic youth whose main military training, consists of mostly religious indoctrination and a little bit of how to hold a rifle. They have one of the worst rates, by the way, of shooting enemy soldiers. So one of the things that's happened with Americans in Afghanistan is they're not being killed at the same rate, for example, that they were in Iraq. Military tactics are primitive weaponry. They use harassment, petty sabotage, small units attacks. Their communications are so bad and the U.S. technology is so superior, they've gotten to use now flashlights and torches as a way of doing some signaling on the battlefield. They're not a mass mobilization organization. Yet, how strong are they? In 2002, they were 4,000, and then 7,000, then 9,500, 12,500, and in 2006, 17,000. They were growing not so much because of the wonderful future that the Taliban were offering, but because of the other things already mentioned. By the way, the Al-Qaeda that we never managed to take on during this whole last 7 years is also weak. It's an elitist organization. It's more a conspiracy with no more than about 500 true cadre, that is skilled operatives at the top of the Al-Qaeda, and a couple of thousand regular sort of Al-Qaeda troops, if you will, the grunts on the ground in Pakistan, another couple of thousand in Afghanistan. Again, very small, and if we could liquidate those 500 people, excuse my CIA terminology, Al-Qaeda would be finished. Unlike the Vietnamese, who had 100,000, 200,000 cadres, skilled organizers and combat leaders and so forth. Well, the interesting thing is that all of our activities have violated the U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. Now, I know because the taskmaster over there is going to drag me off the stage that I've got to really rush through what is, I think, the most interesting thing. You can download it. General Petraeus' Counterinsurgency New Manual is available to the public, and it sums up 30 years' worth of attempts to put together a true scientific counterinsurgency doctrine. It's excellent, and I say that as a person of the left. We have to always give your opponents credit. The sad fact is that the United States governments have refused to follow the best thinking of their own military intelligence establishment, and one of them is these counterinsurgency lessons learned things. It identifies that in terms of counterinsurgency, for example, 80% of counterinsurgency is political, economic, social, and good government. Only 20% is the military stuff. This is the Army and the Marines saying it in terms of counterinsurgency doctrine. While when they talk about operations, civic security, civil control, essential services, government, economic infrastructure as the things you should be doing. In fact, their manual is divided up in that way. 1 out of 6 things are the military stuff. Actually, paramilitary is 2, but that still leaves the 4 main sections divided up in non-military stuff. Give you an example of how absurd this whole war is. They have a very interesting chapter on intelligence, and a key example of the huge amount of people needed to carry this out, and I want to make your eyes start to glaze over as you think about this, is the 40 or 50 pages they devote to doing social, cultural, political, economic profiles of the population at a lower level, including describing operational environment, geography, popular support, mapping ethnic, religious differences, and so on. It requires thousands of translators. They actually have about 40 book pages devoted to how you find translators, how you train them, and the levels of security, 3 levels of security in terms of translator 1, translator 2, translator 3, and trust and reliability. This is in a country where even today, we don't have the most secure translators. We don't have more than a dozen or 2 for each of the major language groups, where the U.S. still has, or had until recently, only 700 Arabic speakers fluent, able to do either military or civic action, where we have to hire thousands of rather doubtful or unscrupulous types doing our translation work for us. And yet, we're supposed to carry out this sophisticated thing. Now, what I'm saying here is trying to hammer away at one of the great quotes that I have to skip. I'm sorry, I can see he's getting frustrated over there. The ratio to combatants, the ratio of combatants needed, and I'll just quote something. Most density recommendations fall in the range of 20 to 25 counterinsurgents for every 1,000 residents. 20 counterinsurgents per 1,000 is often considered the minimum troop density required for counterinsurgency operations. Now, that is 25 if you deal with all the difficulties of Afghanistan. If you can do your math, and there's about 25 million people roughly in Afghanistan, unless we should throw in the other 10 million Pashtuns across the border, but let's say the 25 million Afghanis, most of whom are in fighting age, young men, that means 500,000 people doing frontline quality professional fighting and aid and civic action and all the other stuff. 500,000. Right now, we have less than 100,000 reliables in Afghanistan. So the 17,000 is a joke. And Petraeus knows it, and I don't know why they're keeping their mouth shut. Just to do the combat stuff, they do need what the Soviets wanted to have, which was about 200 to 250,000 frontline combat people, not amateurs, but well-trained. In summary, we have a labor-intensive thing being carried out on the cheap. It's as if Donald Rumsfeld, who wanted to fight every war on the cheap and thought he could get away with it, is still in control. Now, there's the sordid history of the U.S. of the last 7 years. I disagree with just looking at the last 7 years. You know, there's the old thing about second chances. Does a wife or a husband deserve a third or a fourth chance on adultery? We've had 3 tries already, and Obama wants to do 4. The first try was doing it right in terms of what we should have done working with the Soviets back in the 80s. Second try is when we abandoned the Afghans completely in the 1990s and set things up for the rise of the Taliban. So that's a try. We just walked away from it. That was second chance in Afghan eyes. Third chance is the Bush mess. And the fourth chance starts now. I'm sorry, when I see some guy who's been married and divorced 3 times talking about getting married a 4th time, I have doubts about putting a $20 bill on that marriage. And the Afghans are a little more ruthless and tough in evaluating that stuff. Well, here's our record. Based on what I said before, we lay against the template of the ideal counterinsurgency that's based on 20, 30 cases around the world, and we get gross shortage of qualified personnel, too little money, poorly administered, parceled out to contractors, you know that word, contractor, not enough troops, sporadic violent changes of strategy and tactics. In terms of building the militia and the peace in the army, there were changes almost every 6 months, going in totally opposite directions each time. And rotations of our best people on the ground who, after a few months, are finally getting the hang of it, they're out in 9 months or a year. And somebody has to start all over again. So it's no mystery that making a living in rural areas is one of the main grievances that we could be helping solve. Import substitution in the cities to provide employment for all the city youth who've no way to work. Dealing with women's issues somehow in the countryside without completely ticking off the religious tribal type thing. Corruption 3 times the normal. The president's one brother has made a fortune off of opium. The other brother has made a fortune off of building buildings in Kabul. Warlordism that's continued on, in which some of the most, quote, reliable U.S. allies there are warlords going back to the 80s, and so on. I won't mention public school system and things like that. My favorite mistake, by the way, in terms of all of this, and I want to see, you tell me if he winces, is we try to build a national army. 60% of the ground troops in that national army that's been built so far, and they're considered better than any of the other stuff, the militia, police, and so on, are Pashtun foot soldiers. 60% or so of the officers are Tajik, the old Northern Alliance people. Now, I tell you, I don't want to hurt anyone's ethnic sensibility, but if I were a Polish foot soldier and a Prussian was my officer, I would not be very happy, and that's exactly what they've got in the new Afghan army, with the United States having to provide translators. Here's this poor U.S. guy having to have two translators, one to deal with the Tajik officer and the other with the Pashtun troops, as he tries to show them how to break into somebody's house to search for a hostile enemy. Anyway, is the final thing I want to deal with a little bit here are some key questions, and Joe threw them out as teasers, so I guess I can too because I don't have time to answer them. Is Al-Qaeda the real goal or just a fig leaf? I am truly beginning to feel that the whole hunt for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden has been a fig leaf in terms of the whole Afghan mess. Who is the enemy? I would love to administer truth serum to the Washington types on who is the enemy we're fighting there and get it out of them. I think, question, is there too little increase of U.S. troops to make a difference? Absolutely yes. At least we should put in 150,000 more if we're going to get anything done. I want to bring a couple of conclusions here. Sometimes in society and in the movies, there are no good guys. Americans like to have somebody wearing a white hat. After the destruction of the urban, somewhat educated, somewhat modernized sector of Afghan society, driven into exile, murdered by one group or the other, fragmented and just plain scared, I don't see who the good guys are. It certainly isn't Karzai and his friends and associates, and it certainly isn't the Taliban. Sometimes, to reinforce what Joe said earlier, it's better to do nothing. And I remember the patient oath of a doctor, which is, it is better not to do something than to hurt the patient. Don't act, or whatever that phrasing is. Don't act unless you're sure you won't damage the patient by acting, by not acting. And finally, the American thing, you know, in a lot of movies that the Europeans make, they make two endings. One for us and one for them, and they're more mature and wiser and sort of more worldly. We always have to have happy endings. There's been any number of things. Sometimes there are no happy endings, and we have to have some politicians with the guts to say it. Finally, I'd like to mention one thing, which is a final fact that I couldn't go into, and God, the hammer's coming. Here it is. Please wrap up, you see. So I will wrap up with the thing I wanted to share with you. You could download this online. It's the National Intelligence Council's forecast for 2025. And you can look it up and download it. It should be a reading required in every single U.S. foreign policy course taught in the country. It's a brilliant 150-page document written by the combined 16 U.S. intelligence agencies, the CIA, the NSA, the State Department, and so forth. All 16 of them put together this forecast. And one of the things they came out with is the main threat to the United States in the next 20 years is economic competition focused on resources that are going short. It's not consumer markets or labor, it's energy, food, water, and minerals. 3 of the 4 scenarios that they outline in this have 0 to do with terrorism, religious ideology, Al-Qaeda, or anything like it. The key things they're worried about is the decline of Europe and Japan, the rise of Brazil, China, Russia, and India, and the loss of U.S. superpower status in front of potential economic wars with these other companies, and blocs. It's certainly not the old thing of putting pressure on Russia in terms of Afghanistan. It's certainly not the 3rd and 4th choices for pipelines. I believe that the only conclusion we can have is no Iraq war in Afghanistan. Thank you.